In 1901, Maryland was a land still shadowed by the legacy of slavery. Though emancipation had ended legal bondage decades earlier, the scars remained in the soil, in the towns, and most painfully, in the lives of those who had once been enslaved. It was in this tenuous world that Edward Carmichael came into being, a man whose life would leave a trail of suffering and despair few could escape. At first glance he appeared ordinary, polite, neatly dressed, and socially adept. Yet beneath this polished exterior lay a calculating cruelty, a hunger for control that would shape the lives of everyone around him. From childhood, Edward exhibited an unnatural fascination with authority. He would gather neighborhood children and compel them to obey tasks far beyond their age, not through overt violence, but through relentless insistence and manipulation. Those who resisted found themselves ostracized, humiliated, or subtly tormented. This early exercise in domination was the first sign of a lifetime spent bending others to his will, of a mind attuned to power and blind to empathy. By the time he reached adulthood, Edward had learned to recognize opportunity where others saw hardship. Maryland's black communities, still recovering from generations of oppression, were vulnerable to men like him. Families struggled to maintain small farms, to feed children, to survive in a society structured against them. Edward saw their vulnerability not as a tragedy but as a means to expand his own influence. Land, labor, and loyalty became tools he wielded with cold efficiency. Edward acquired property along the outskirts of the county, much of it formerly tilled by enslaved hands, and expanded his holdings through manipulation and coercion. He levied exorbitant rents, imposed fines for minor infractions, and demanded labor in exchange for necessities. Families who could not comply were evicted or left destitute. This was not chaotic cruelty. It was systematic. Edward understood that permanent dominance required subtlety, an appearance of legality, a veneer of propriety, a social mask that concealed the suffering beneath. Among the victims was the Henderson family, who had once worked a nearby plantation. Edward forced their eldest son into labor from dawn to dusk, denying education and childhood. The mother spent endless hours sewing, cleaning, and tending to Edward's household, often at the cost of her own health. Younger children endured exposure, malnutrition, and fear. Every action reinforced Edward's control. Disobedience was met not with brute force alone, but with quiet, relentless pressure that eroded dignity and hope. What made Edward uniquely insidious was his understanding of human psychology. He studied his victims, learning weaknesses and attachments, predicting responses, and exploiting them to tighten his grip. He manipulated neighbors, bribed those who might oppose him, and ensured that the only voices daring to speak out were silenced by fear or social consequence. Unlike men who relied on visible violence, Edward's cruelty was invisible yet pervasive, leaving no scars on his own reputation while inflicting lasting damage on others. Even as his power grew, the effects of his actions were evident in those around him. Children lost their vitality, adults moved cautiously, and the community itself began to fracture under the weight of his influence. Yet Edward remained confident, believing that intellect and social finesse placed him above reproach. He ignored whispers of dissent and the quiet rage of the families he oppressed, convinced that his control was unassailable. Edward's cruelty extended into the domestic sphere as well. Marriage, household management, and social gatherings were all stages upon which he demonstrated dominance. Servants worked ceaselessly, family members were dismissed, and every interaction was a calculated display of authority. Even in public, Edward projected charm and respectability, attending social events, cultivating alliances, and masking the suffering that enabled his lifestyle. The duality of his existence, polished exterior, hidden cruelty, made him both feared and envied, Yet, beneath the surface, isolation began to take root. Genuine connections proved impossible when relationships were transactional, based on fear or convenience. Edward could command obedience, but he could not inspire loyalty, friendship, or love. Early cracks appeared in the foundations of his life, though he remained blind to them. The seeds of eventual regret had been planted, subtle but inexorable, set to grow alongside the suffering he cultivated. The damage Edward inflicted was both material and psychological. Families were fractured, children's potential stifled, and parents left impotent and despairing. Entire communities shifted, reshaping themselves around caution and compliance. Meanwhile, Edward's wealth and influence expanded, but it was built on the misery of others. The lives of those he oppressed, the Hendersons, the small, black families laboring under impossible demands, would remain, largely undocumented by history, their suffering preserved only in memory and whispered testimony. By the first decade of the 20th century, Edward Carmichael had established himself as a man of wealth, property, and influence, yet the very traits that secured his position, manipulation, cruelty, control, also sowed the first signs of isolation. True friendship, empathy, and respect were impossible for a man who measured relationships in obedience, labor, and submission. While outward appearances suggested success, the unseen cost to human lives was profound. Even as Edward celebrated his accomplishments, the consequences of his cruelty were quietly spreading. Children who had once obeyed out of fear were learning to escape, leaving homes and farms behind. Parents, broken by relentless pressure, passed on caution and mistrust to their children. The community grew wary. Neighbors spoke in guarded tones, and the subtle fabric of social cohesion frayed. Edward, focused on accumulation and control, remained unaware of these forces, yet they were gathering strength, ready to reshape his world. His cruelty was methodical, almost clinical. It left no visible scars on his reputation, yet inflicted wounds that would last for generations. Families were left broken, their dreams stolen, their autonomy stripped away. Edward viewed these outcomes as incidental, collateral to his ambition, unaware that the echoes of his actions would one day return to confront him. By the end of this period, Edward Carmichael stood as a figure defined by control and domination, a man whose influence reached into every corner of his county. He had mastered the art of invisible cruelty, wielding it with precision, and ensuring that the world saw only his polished exterior. Yet beneath the surface, the first threads of isolation and eventual regret had begun to form, quietly waiting to entangle him in the consequences of a life spent harming others. Maryland, still a land shaped by the history of slavery, held the stories of those who had suffered under men like Edward. The laborers, the children, the families whose lives were quietly destroyed, all bore the cost of his ambition. These silent witnesses to cruelty would become the measure by which Edward's life was ultimately judged, and though he could not see it yet, the foundation of his power, built on fear and submission, was also the foundation of his eventual solitude and remorse. Edward Carmichael's influence in Maryland had expanded steadily, moving from subtle dominance to overt control. Where once his power had been exercised with quiet precision, it now flourished in its most visible form, leaving an unmistakable mark on the people and land around him. The families he had begun to dominate, those who survived the early pressures, were now fully ensnared in a web of relentless labor, intimidation, and emotional subjugation. By this point, his cruelty had grown not from necessity, but from habit and ambition, a refined force that calculated misery as efficiently as profit. The Hendersons, among the earliest of his victims, had long since ceased to hope for relief. Their eldest son, forced to work endlessly in Edward's fields, bore the visible signs of toil, hands cracked and calloused, eyes dulled from fatigue and despair. The mother, once proud and resilient, moved like a shadow through the endless tasks of Edward's household. Her body weakened, her spirit eroded. The younger children, stripped of both security and comfort, developed a quiet, constant anxiety, an instinctive understanding that every movement, every word, might provoke punishment or deepen their suffering. Edward observed these outcomes with satisfaction, a testament to his mastery of control. As his holdings grew, so did the scope of his exploitation. He acquired additional parcels of land, formerly worked by enslaved families, bringing them under his supervision through legal loopholes, intimidation, and manipulation. He demanded labor that far exceeded any fair measure, extracting value not only in work, but in obedience, compliance, and fear. No appeal to justice could reach these families. Edward had crafted a network of influence so subtle, so complete, that intervention seemed impossible. Even neighbors, wary of the man's public reputation, whispered behind closed doors, powerless to confront him. Edward's cruelty was now multidimensional. It extended beyond mere labor to psychological domination. He would call families to his residence under the pretense of aid, offering small rewards or promises of leniency, only to increase demands in exchange. Children were forced to memorize schedules, perform tasks without question, and report on one another's compliance. Families internalized the oppressive hierarchy, and Edward's household became a microcosm of total control. The tyrant at the center, subjects obedient in body, mind, and spirit. One particularly grim example was the Williamson family, brought under Edward's control after a neighbor's misfortune. Their farm was modest, their resources meager, and their hope fragile. Edward systematically dismantled their autonomy. He dictated planting and harvesting schedules, withheld payment until the exact conditions of labor were met, and punished minor mistakes with extended hours or the withdrawal of essentials. The father, once a man of quiet pride, became withdrawn and fearful. The mother, exhausted and beaten down, clung desperately to her children while enduring endless demands. The children's laughter disappeared, replaced by silence and vigilance. Edward, to outsiders, was merely a demanding landowner. To those living under him, he was an unrelenting presence whose authority permeated every moment. His rise was also marked by manipulation of social networks. Edward understood that power was most durable when reinforced by perception. He cultivated allies among local elites, attended public gatherings, and presented an image of philanthropy. In these circles he was charming and persuasive, a man of refinement and culture. Few suspected the misery that enabled his lifestyle, and fewer still had the courage to confront him. This duality enhanced his cruelty, allowing him to act with impunity, protected by his carefully constructed public persona. The labor itself became increasingly exploitative. Families were compelled to work not only in fields and households but in ancillary enterprises that Edward established: sawmills, workshops, and minor commercial operations, all of which operated under his strict supervision. Any delay, hesitation, or sign of dissent was met with subtle intimidation, a pointed remark, a withheld meal, or the threat of eviction. Over time, fear became internalized. Parents no longer guided their children with encouragement, but with caution, teaching them to anticipate Edward's demands rather than to hope for freedom or relief. The psychological toll of this control cannot be overstated. Edward's victims existed in a constant state of vigilance, where a single misstep could invite punishment. Children grew silent, adults spoke minimally, and the community itself adjusted its rhythms to avoid crossing him. Edward, seeing only obedience and productivity, considered this the height of success. To him, the fear he cultivated was evidence of intelligence and strategy, not the cruelty it truly represented. Yet this fear was also a precursor to the isolation that would eventually consume him. For dominance achieved through terror breeds no loyalty, only resentment and eventual distance. Even his immediate family felt the subtle reach of his tyranny. Servants in his household were overworked and fearful. Spouses accommodated his whims out of necessity rather than affection, and social interactions became exercises in power dynamics. Edward's marriage, like his estates, was a stage upon which control was displayed and refined. Each action reinforced a hierarchy in which he stood at the apex, untouchable and unaccountable, but cracks were emerging. The very families he oppressed began to resist, subtly at first. Children escaped when opportunities arose. Neighbors began to murmur in ways that could not be entirely silenced, and those subjected to his labor learned to navigate loopholes to protect themselves. Edward, however, remained largely oblivious to these early acts of defiance. He saw compliance in the surface obedience of bodies, unaware of the quiet subversion taking root in minds and hearts. Despite the mounting human cost, Edward's ambitions grew. He invested in expansions that increased his influence and revenue, taking pride in the empire he had constructed from obedience, labor, and fear. Each acquisition, each new family under his control, was a demonstration of skill and vision. Yet with every gain, the isolation of his life increased imperceptibly. True companionship was impossible, for those around him either served or feared him. Authority replaced affection. Strategy replaced empathy. In this, the seeds of regret and solitude that would later dominate his life were sown. The lives of those affected were a tapestry of suffering. Children who should have known education and freedom were instead trained to serve. Mothers who should have known security lived in constant anxiety. Fathers who should have had pride and agency were reduced to silent obedience. Communities shifted to accommodate fear, and the social fabric frayed under the strain of Edward's dominance. Yet the broader historical record would largely overlook these human costs, recording only Edward's wealth, his landholdings, and his public influence. The quiet devastation remained invisible to outsiders, yet in every household under his control, it was unmistakable. One of the most striking aspects of this period was Edward's mastery of invisibility and cruelty. To those who did not live under him, he was merely assertive, exacting, even fair. To those who did, he was an omnipresent authority, whose demands defined every moment of life. The psychological power he wielded ensured that families internalized their oppression, perpetuating cycles of obedience and despair that reinforced his dominance. Without overt violence, this systemic cruelty became the hallmark of his reign, a silent and enduring force. Edward Carmichael had reached the apex of his influence in Maryland. Families like the Hendersons, the Williamsons, and countless others were bound to him through fear, labor, and social coercion. Communities had adapted to his presence, calculating their movements, words, and choices to avoid conflict. And Edward, absorbed in the expansion of his wealth and authority, remained blind to the subtle cracks forming in his empire, cracks that would, in time, widen into irrevocable fractures. The rise of his tyranny had established a pattern: cruelty rewarded with wealth, obedience enforced by fear, and societal respect maintained through manipulation. Yet it was also the beginning of a life that could never experience genuine connection, where isolation lurked behind every achievement. The very families he controlled, the ones who existed in constant anxiety and deprivation, would one day serve as the measure of his failures, reflecting back a life spent in pursuit of dominance rather than compassion, respect, or morality. In 1901 Maryland, Edward Carmichael was no longer a man merely learning control. He had become a figure whose very presence dictated the shape of lives, families, and communities. The human cost of his ambition was enormous, and the legacy of suffering he created was already visible in the weary faces, subdued voices, and broken dreams of those around him. Yet at the height of his power, he remained blind to the inevitable truth. No structure built on fear and subjugation could endure without exacting a price from its architect. By the time Edward Carmichael had fully established himself in Maryland, his influence was no longer subtle. It was absolute. Where once his cruelty had been quiet and methodical, it now reached its most brazen expression. Families under his control were trapped in an unending cycle of labor, fear and humiliation. Children labored in the fields from sunrise to sunset, learning not the value of knowledge or play, but the cold arithmetic of obedience. Mothers endured ceaseless work, tending both Edward's household and the endless demands of their own devastated homes, their health deteriorating as each day passed. Fathers, stripped of autonomy, navigated a world in which resistance meant suffering for those they loved most. The Hendersons, who had survived the earliest phases of Edward's domination, now faced the full weight of his power. Their eldest son, once a spirited youth, had been reduced to a shadow of himself, physically drained and psychologically broken. Each mistake, no matter how minor, was punished by extended labor or the withholding of food. The mother, now frail and listless, moved through the day like a specter, carrying the exhaustion of years. The younger children, trained in constant vigilance, had learned fear as a language, their innocence stripped away with every passing season. Edward observed the family's suffering with detached satisfaction, seeing it as evidence of his ingenuity in controlling others without the need for overt violence. The Williamson family faced an equally relentless ordeal. Their small farm had been absorbed into Edward's growing empire, and their labor now served not only his household but his commercial enterprises, sawmills, workshops, and storage facilities that extended his influence across the county. Every task was meticulously monitored, every delay punished. The father, once a man of quiet pride, had learned to mask fear with resignation, while the mother endured endless toil, clinging desperately to her children even as her strength waned. The children's laughter had vanished entirely, replaced by a careful, constant awareness that any misstep could provoke a reprisal. Edward's cruelty had evolved beyond physical labor into a more insidious form of psychological domination. He manipulated families through promises and threats, offering small rewards for compliance, only to increase demands immediately afterward. Children were taught to report on one another, fostering suspicion and eroding any sense of familial solidarity. Mothers and fathers were forced to police their own children, instilling habits of self-surveillance and fear. The family unit, once a source of protection and comfort, became another instrument of control. Edward had perfected a system in which obedience was maintained not by force alone but by embedding terror into the very structure of daily life. The wider community felt the ripple effects of Edward's tyranny. Neighbors adapted their behaviors, limiting interactions to avoid provoking his wrath. Whispers of dissent were rare and carefully muted. Edward's social influence and reputation provided a protective shield that rendered formal complaints meaningless. Even public authorities, aware of his manipulations, were hesitant to intervene. Edward had learned the art of invisibility and cruelty, ensuring that his victims bore the full brunt of suffering, while he remained outwardly respectable, untouchable, and admired in certain circles. Among the many lives Edward touched, some suffered losses that could never be repaired. Families were torn apart as children were forced into labor elsewhere. Parents were left destitute, and homes fell into disrepair under the relentless demands of labor and oversight. Those who tried to escape were often pursued or punished indirectly, their attempts at independence thwarted by the social and economic networks Edward had constructed. The consequences were long-lasting: psychological trauma, broken families, and a pervasive sense of fear that lingered across generations. Edward's household became a theatre for the display of his absolute control. Servants were overworked and fearful, spouses were compelled into obedience, and social gatherings served as stages for demonstrating superiority. Edward's charm and sophistication in public masked the cruelty that underpinned his empire, allowing him to navigate the elite circles of Maryland society without scrutiny. To outsiders, he was a man of refinement. To those living under him, he was omnipresent, omnipotent, and inescapable. The economic exploitation extended beyond labor into every aspect of life. Families were compelled to provide goods, services, and even children's labor to maintain Edward's enterprises. Payment was often delayed or withheld until demands were met perfectly, creating cycles of dependency that reinforced his dominance. Any hint of dissent was met with subtle intimidation, ensuring that fear became internalized. Parents no longer guided their children with encouragement or love, but with caution, teaching them to navigate Edward's demands rather than to seek freedom or fulfillment. Edward's reach extended to social manipulation as well. He cultivated alliances among local elites, participated in public ceremonies, and maintained the appearance of philanthropy. In this duality lay the core of his cruelty. Public admiration shielded him from accountability while private. Suffering expanded unchecked. Families under his control existed in a constant state of anxiety, adjusting their lives around his whims and anticipating the next imposition. Fear had become both the method and the substance of his power. The psychological impact was profound. Children, conditioned to obedience through punishment and surveillance, lost touch with curiosity and play. Adults, stripped of autonomy, became cautious, calculating every word and movement. Communities adjusted, rhythms and routines modified to avoid conflict. Social bonds eroded under the pressure of omnipresent fear. Edward's cruelty had not only exploited labor but reshaped the very culture of his surroundings, leaving a legacy of submission and anxiety. Even within his own household, isolation was intensifying. True companionship and affection were impossible, replaced by obedience, fear, and transactional relationships. Edward's spouse complied out of necessity. Servants obeyed from fear, and neighbors tolerated him for social or economic convenience. The emotional cost of dominance had begun to manifest subtly in his life. The absence of genuine human connection, the erosion of trust, and the quiet alienation that accompanies unchecked control. Edward's victims were numerous, and their suffering varied in form but not in intensity. Some lost property, others endured physical exhaustion, and all experienced emotional strain. Families who had once been self-sufficient were reduced to dependence on his whims, their futures dictated by the machinations of a man who viewed human life as a tool for gain. These consequences were irreversible. Once broken, relationships and communities could not be easily restored. Edward had reached a point where the human cost of his empire could no longer be mitigated, and the long-term damage was etched into the lives of all who fell under his influence. By the height of his cruelty, Edward had mastered both material and psychological domination. Families lived in constant surveillance. Labor was extracted without limit, and the social fabric of the region adapted to accommodate his presence. Children learned fear as instinct. Adults calculated each action, and communities silently accommodated the pervasive influence of his authority. And yet Edward, absorbed in the expansion of his wealth and social standing, remained blind to the cracks forming in the structures he had built. Subtle signs of resentment, quiet acts of defiance, and the inevitable moral reckoning that awaited him. It was during this period that Edward's legacy of destruction became most evident. The Hendersons' land was depleted, their spirits broken, and their family unit strained almost beyond repair. The Williamsons had lost not only their autonomy, but their sense of identity and hope. Generations of children had been conditioned into fear and submission, and the broader community had adapted, if reluctantly, to a new rhythm defined by Edward's demands. The full magnitude of his cruelty was clear to anyone paying attention, though few dared to acknowledge it openly. Yet Edward remained convinced of his invincibility. He interpreted obedience and fear as admiration, control as genius, and isolation as a natural consequence of leadership rather than a symptom of moral corrosion. The paradox of his existence, immense public influence paired with private tyranny, made him simultaneously powerful and vulnerable. The very methods that enabled his empire of cruelty also seeded the eventual downfall he could not yet perceive. In these years, Edward Carmichael reached the pinnacle of his control. Labor was extracted flawlessly, obedience enforced through fear, and social perception carefully managed to ensure continued admiration, or at least tolerance. Families lived under constant pressure, their lives dictated by his whims, their identities reshaped by oppression. And yet, beneath the surface of this seeming perfection, the seeds of regret and isolation were quietly taking root, preparing to transform the life of a man who believed himself untouchable into one defined by the consequences of his cruelty. By the middle of the first decade of the 20th century, Edward Carmichael's reign of control in Maryland had reached a level few could challenge. Families were bound to him by fear, labor, and economic dependence. Yet beneath the surface of obedience, subtle forces were beginning to strain the foundations of his empire. These forces did not arrive as loud rebellions or dramatic confrontations, but as quiet, almost imperceptible shifts, whispers among neighbors, small acts of defiance, and the slow accumulation of resentment that no amount of wealth or charm could entirely suppress. The Hendersons, who had endured years of relentless labor, began to exhibit signs of quiet resistance. The eldest son, once entirely subservient, started to take advantage of brief absences to steal moments of freedom in the fields, hiding tools or delaying work to reclaim a sense of autonomy. The mother, exhausted from decades of toil, began to teach her younger children small lessons in discretion, how to evade punishment, how to conserve energy, how to survive without drawing Edward's attention. These acts were minor, almost invisible to outsiders, but they represented the first cracks in a system Edward had assumed was unbreakable. Similarly, the Williamson family found ways to negotiate their survival. By carefully timing their work, by exploiting minor loopholes in Edward's demands, and by collaborating in silence with neighbors, they carved small spaces of agency within an oppressive framework. These maneuvers were subtle, but they revealed a fundamental truth Edward had never accounted for. Fear could enforce obedience, but it could not eliminate human ingenuity or the desire for freedom. Each act of defiance, no matter how slight, was a reminder that control built solely on terror was inherently fragile. Even within Edward's household, early signs of tension began to emerge. Servants, though still bound by fear and obligation, whispered among themselves, sharing grievances and comparing notes on the small ways they could resist. Some began to consider leaving, though opportunities were limited and perilous. Edward remained largely oblivious, his focus consumed by expansion and the maintenance of his public image. He continued to interpret surface-level obedience as evidence of total control, unaware that beneath this veneer, the structures he had imposed were slowly eroding. The first direct consequences of his cruelty began to manifest in his social and economic life as well. Some neighbors, once intimidated into compliance, quietly withdrew support or refused to participate in his schemes. Rumors of his exploitative practices circulated beyond the immediate region, reaching ears that could not be easily silenced. While Edward retained influence, The networks that had previously reinforced his dominance showed signs of strain. These early fractures were subtle, but they carried the potential to undermine even the carefully constructed image he had worked so hard to maintain. The psychological toll on Edward himself, though not yet fully apparent, also began to accumulate. A man who had spent decades controlling others and cultivating fear now found that control required increasing energy, vigilance, and calculation. Every act of cruelty demanded observation. Every threat required maintenance. While outwardly composed and socially polished, Edward's private life began to feel the weight of his decisions. Isolation, previously unnoticed, started to assert itself in quiet ways. Fleeting moments of unease, an inability to trust even those closest to him, and an emerging awareness that fear was a brittle foundation for lasting influence. Families under his dominion were becoming increasingly resourceful, not through confrontation, but through adaptation. Children learned to anticipate his moods, mothers found subtle ways to conserve strength, and fathers sought minor loopholes that allowed them to reclaim fragments of dignity. Edward interpreted these behaviors as compliance, failing to recognize the growing undercurrent of resistance. The labor continued, the fields remained productive, but the human spirit that had been oppressed was quietly reasserting itself. Economic challenges also began to surface. Some of Edward's enterprises, while profitable, were becoming harder to maintain as workers exerted their own small measures of agency. Delays, minor errors, and absences, all previously overlooked or easily corrected, now demanded attention and increased scrutiny. Edward responded predictably, tightening control and increasing demands, but the effort required began to strain his time and energy. This tension was invisible to the broader public, but it marked the first real vulnerability in a system he had assumed was unassailable. Even the Hendersons' children, long trained in silence and fear, displayed early forms of cunning and resistance. Small acts, hiding tools, feigning illness, or finding brief moments to escape. Supervision represented the nascent stirrings of autonomy. These gestures, though seemingly inconsequential, were profound in their implications. They demonstrated that Edward's influence, no matter how complete it appeared, could never fully extinguish the human desire for agency. The Williamson family's quiet defiance manifested in communal coordination. They exchanged information with neighbors, coordinated minor delays, and cultivated a network of support that Edward had not foreseen. By working collectively, these families carved out spaces where Edward's control was incomplete, creating small pockets of autonomy within an otherwise oppressive environment. It was a subtle form of resistance, but it was remarkably effective, and it would grow more consequential in the years to come. Within Edward's own household, servants and family members began to exhibit hesitation, small lapses in obedience that were previously unthinkable, minor acts of defiance, forgetting instructions, delaying tasks, or covertly protecting one another, emerged as patterns. Edward, still confident in his mastery, misread these signals as minor lapses easily corrected, yet the truth was undeniable. The structures of fear and submission he had relied upon were showing cracks, and these cracks were widening incrementally with each passing day. Edward's reputation in public circles remained intact. To outsiders, he was still the model landowner, a man of wealth, influence, and propriety. Yet this public facade masked the growing instability beneath the surface. The very fear that had secured his empire now required constant reinforcement, increasing the energy, vigilance, and ruthlessness necessary to maintain control. The balance was delicate, and even minor miscalculations could lead to disproportionate consequences. Families affected by Edward's cruelty were no longer entirely passive. They engaged in acts of preservation, seeking to maintain physical safety psychological well-being, and small measures of independence. Children navigated their environment with caution. Mothers concealed resources, and fathers negotiated minor freedoms where possible. These efforts, while subtle, represented a fundamental challenge to Edward's authority. They demonstrated that control built on oppression could be resisted, even in small ways. Even Edward's financial strategies were beginning to encounter friction. Labor, while still abundant, required increasingly complex management. Delays, small errors, and resistance added layers of difficulty that had not existed earlier in his career. Edward responded with heightened supervision and stricter demands, creating a feedback loop in which maintaining control consumed ever more of his attention. This dynamic, though invisible to most, foreshadowed the eventual erosion of the empire he had constructed through fear and manipulation. The psychological consequences for Edward were subtle, but cumulative. Isolation deepened, not through external intervention, but as a natural byproduct of a life spent in domination. True companionship, empathy, and loyalty were impossible in an environment defined by fear. Even as he expanded influence and accumulated wealth, the cracks in his social and emotional foundation grew, imperceptible to the man himself, but obvious to those living under his control. By the end of this period, Edward Carmichael's empire was still formidable, yet its fragility was apparent to anyone who looked closely. Families were learning to resist in quiet, effective ways. Labor, while still productive, was increasingly unreliable, and the psychological burden of maintaining absolute control was beginning to weigh on him. The first consequences of his cruelty, subtle though they were, had begun to emerge, signaling that even the most meticulously constructed structures of fear are never impervious to the resilience of human agency. Maryland, once seemingly subdued under Edward's influence, was quietly shifting. The Hendersons, the Williamsons, and other families had begun to reclaim fragments of autonomy, demonstrating that the human spirit could endure and resist, even in the harshest conditions. Edward, confident in his mastery, remained largely unaware that these small acts of defiance were laying the groundwork for the eventual unraveling of the very empire he had spent decades constructing. In the lives of those he oppressed, the first hints of hope began to appear. Children learned survival skills and subtle forms of autonomy. Mothers safeguarded their remaining energy, and fathers navigated the oppressive environment with ingenuity. Communities quietly adapted, maintaining their cohesion despite Edward's attempts to dominate. These early signs of resistance, though small, marked the beginning of a slow but inevitable challenge to his control. And so, the empire of Edward Carmichael, while still outwardly imposing, had begun to show the earliest signs of vulnerability. Subtle resistance, psychological strain, and the quiet erosion of fear signaled the first true consequences of a life built on cruelty. For the families who had endured years of oppression, these cracks were the beginnings of reclamation, a testament to the endurance of human agency, even under relentless domination. As the years advanced, the carefully constructed empire of Edward Carmichael began to show unmistakable signs of erosion. The very families he had dominated for decades were no longer passive. Quiet defiance had grown bolder. Whispers of resistance evolved into subtle but decisive actions. Children found ways to slip away from oppressive schedules. Parents navigated minor freedoms, and entire households coordinated to reclaim agency wherever possible. These actions, imperceptible at first, had cumulative effects that began to undermine the unchallenged authority Edward had relied upon for so long. The Hendersons, whose lives had been entirely shaped by Edward's demands, now engaged in acts of reclamation. The eldest son, no longer a mere obedient laborer, began to flee the fields under cover of darkness, taking only what he could carry. The mother, who had endured unrelenting toil for decades, quietly cultivated a network of neighbors, willing to provide refuge or resources. The younger children learned to anticipate Edward's movements, finding brief moments to play, read, or simply breathe without fear. These small acts, though seemingly insignificant to Edward, represented the beginning of cracks in his empire of fear. The Williamson family had taken even more deliberate steps. Some of their children were sent to distant relatives, hidden from Edward's immediate influence. Fathers and mothers collaborated with sympathetic neighbors to protect assets, food, and information. Even small deviations from Edward's strict schedules were carefully executed, reducing his control over labor and diminishing his capacity to enforce obedience. Edward, still confident in his mastery, misinterpreted these minor adjustments as temporary lapses rather than the precursors to broader resistance. Economic pressures began to amplify the vulnerabilities of Edward's empire. Maintaining control over multiple properties, enterprises, and households demanded increasing oversight. Labor, once predictably compliant, became inconsistent. Tasks were delayed, instructions misinterpreted deliberately or accidentally, and productivity began to fluctuate. Edward responded with escalating demands, tighter supervision, and threats meant to reinforce fear. Yet each intervention consumed more of his energy and time, subtly eroding the efficiency that had once made his operations so formidable. Edward's isolation deepened alongside the unraveling of obedience. Socially, he remained polished and outwardly respected, attending public events, entertaining influential neighbors, and maintaining the appearance of refinement. Yet the human connections he had long ignored now receded even further. Spouses and family members, though outwardly compliant, began to maintain distance, and former allies, those whose interests had once aligned with his, grew wary or indifferent. Loyalty founded on fear is fragile, and the erosion of perceived invincibility made Edward increasingly alone. Within his household, the servants and family, members who had quietly endured years of oppression, began to assert subtle independence. Instructions were followed less rigorously. Small errors appeared in tasks previously executed flawlessly, and whispered communications revealed growing dissatisfaction. Edward interpreted these lapses as minor frustrations, yet they were indicators of a deeper shift. The psychological grip he had long maintained was weakening. Fear could not sustain itself indefinitely without reinforcement, and even the most compliant could exploit gaps in supervision to reclaim autonomy. The broader community, once meticulously aligned with Edward's interests, also began to recalibrate. Neighbors who had tolerated his cruelty, out of caution now, took small steps to withdraw support. Some refused to participate in ventures that directly benefited him, while others discreetly provided aid to families seeking refuge or escape. These actions were not overt confrontations, but the cumulative effect was significant. Edward's influence, while still substantial, was no longer absolute. Subtle social resistance, combined with economic friction and personal defiance, created the first real fractures in his authority. Many of the enslaved or formerly enslaved families under Edward's control began to seize opportunities to leave, escaping to counties or states beyond his reach. Each flight carried symbolic and practical consequences. The labor pool diminished, resources were diverted to track or compensate for absences, and the aura of invincibility Edward had cultivated eroded. The departures were a quiet, persistent form of rebellion, demonstrating that even decades of oppression could not permanently suppress the desire for freedom. Within Edward's own mind, subtle anxieties began to emerge. Though he continued to project confidence, private moments revealed the strain of maintaining control. Every deviation in labor, every whisper of resistance, and every escaped family demanded attention, reflection, and intervention. He had spent decades refining systems of manipulation, fear, and obedience, Yet the very people he had oppressed now forced him into reactive measures, consuming energy and exposing vulnerabilities. For the first time, Edward began to confront the consequences of a life devoted entirely to control. The social isolation became more pronounced as former. Allies and associates distanced themselves. Some avoided Edward's gatherings, unwilling to be implicated in his increasingly apparent cruelty. Others withdrew support for minor enterprises, or refused to enforce agreements that had previously benefited him. Edward misinterpreted these actions as minor betrayals rather than evidence of a shifting power dynamic. Yet the truth was undeniable. The networks of influence that had supported him were fraying, and his ability to command obedience without resistance was waning. Economic decline intertwined with social isolation. Labor, while still present, required increasingly detailed supervision. Minor mistakes, deliberate delays, and acts of subtle sabotage accumulated. Edward responded predictably, with increasing severity, intensifying demands, and heightened observation. These reactions, though intended to maintain control, only exacerbated the problem, creating a feedback loop in which the effort to dominate consumed ever more of his energy and attention. Families under Edward's influence became more resourceful. Children navigated daily life with ingenuity, parents protected assets, and households coordinated to maintain autonomy wherever possible. Each small victory, an hour of unsupervised play, a hidden meal, a minor lapse in labor, represented a shift in the balance of power. Edward remained unaware of the cumulative effect, yet his empire, long thought invulnerable, was quietly unraveling from within. The psychological consequences of this growing resistance were profound for Edward. Years spent in absolute dominance had left him incapable of forming genuine human connections. Now, as obedience weakened, the isolation that had long been invisible became impossible to ignore. True companionship, empathy, and trust were absent from his life, replaced entirely by fear-driven compliance. The solitude, previously obscured by the illusion of power, now emerged as a palpable and inescapable presence. By this stage, Edward's cruelty had generated irreversible consequences for the families under his control. The Hendersons had lost much of their land, their sense of safety, and the cohesion of their household. The Williamsons had endured decades of labor, surveillance, and humiliation, yet retained the cunning to preserve fragments of dignity and autonomy. Across Maryland, children and parents alike had absorbed trauma that would echo through generations. Edward's influence, while still formidable, was increasingly undermined by the very resilience he had underestimated. Even as the first cracks widened, Edward continued to expand his holdings and assert control, driven by habit and the illusion of invincibility. Yet the cumulative impact of economic friction, social withdrawal, and familial defiance began to strain his mental and emotional capacity. Maintaining dominance required ever-increasing vigilance, exacting measures, and constant energy, highlighting the unsustainable nature of a life devoted entirely to the subjugation of others. In the lives of those he oppressed, the first glimpses of freedom emerged. Children learned the value of subtle defiance. Mothers and fathers navigated minor escapes from labor, and families coordinated to protect one another. These acts, while small individually, collectively challenged the authority Edward had relied upon for decades. They marked the beginning of a transformation in the balance of power, signaling that oppression, no matter how absolute it seems, is always vulnerable to the persistence and ingenuity of human will. By the end of this period, Edward Carmichael's isolation had intensified, and the durability of his empire had begun to falter. Labor was less reliable, social networks had begun to withdraw support, and families under his control were reclaiming agency. The first true consequences of decades of cruelty were unfolding. revealing a truth long obscured by fear and dominance. Power built solely on the subjugation of others is inherently unstable, and those subjected to it will inevitably find ways to resist. Maryland's landscape, shaped by centuries of oppression and control, bore witness not only to Edward's cruelty, but to the resilience of the human spirit. Families who had endured exploitation and terror now began to navigate paths toward survival and autonomy, and Edward, despite his continued efforts to maintain dominance, found himself increasingly isolated, confronted with the consequences of a life built on fear, labor and submission rather than empathy, justice or connection. Edward Carmichael's estate had grown vast, a sprawling testament to decades of labor, extracted from those who had no choice but to comply. The wealth, the carefully managed lands, the social prestige, everything that had once symbolized dominance, now pressed heavily against him, revealing cracks in the empire he had believed unassailable. Families he had oppressed with precision and fear were no longer entirely under his control. Subtle resistance had evolved into deliberate actions. Children who had endured years of relentless labor began slipping away in secret, seizing opportunities to reclaim autonomy wherever it presented itself. Parents navigated tasks strategically, quietly protecting resources and possessions. Households collaborated with neighbors, forging networks of subtle defiance that Edward had never anticipated. The Hendersons, whose lives had been consumed by Edward's relentless demands, operated with quiet ingenuity. The eldest son now moved independently, finding ways to escape supervision for hours, sometimes days, carrying with him small but crucial possessions that ensured the family could endure. The mother, long broken by toil and fear, cultivated discreet alliances with sympathetic neighbors, hiding food, clothing, and tools that would allow her children brief reprieves from constant oversight. Even the youngest children began learning to anticipate Edward's moods and movements, testing boundaries, and discovering freedom in ways imperceptible to him. The Williamson family employed more deliberate strategies. Laborers were covertly relocated to distant lands where Edward's reach could not follow. Parents coordinated with other families to conceal livestock, tools, and harvested crops. Children were trained to move quietly, anticipate supervision, and act independently whenever possible. The meticulous order Edward had imposed on their lives began to unravel as these small acts of defiance compounded, creating a network of independence and subtle resistance he could no longer control. Edward's public reputation remained intact, yet its foundation was increasingly fragile. Whispers of exploitation and escape circulated quietly beyond his estate. Social circles, once deferential, grew wary, subtly distancing themselves from his ventures and gatherings. Former allies and neighbors, previously reliant on fear or convenience to maintain silence, now withdrew support, leaving Edward with a veneer of influence but little substance. The systems of compliance he had built for decades required constant maintenance, and even minor lapses demanded immediate attention. Isolation intensified within his household. Servants performed duties mechanically, obeying instructions without care or respect, their compliance a shell of the obedience that had once reinforced his dominance. Family members maintained distance, engaging in superficial conversation while privately disengaging from his authority. Every interaction reminded Edward that power maintained by fear alone could not replace trust, affection, or loyalty. Relationships had been sacrificed to dominance, and the cost now pressed heavily against him, unyielding and impossible to ignore. Economic pressures highlighted vulnerabilities Edward had long ignored. Crops mismanaged, livestock neglected, and workshops operating inefficiently required more oversight than ever before. Minor mistakes, intentional or inadvertent, multiplied. Edward responded with heightened supervision, stricter demands and threats intended to reinforce control. Each intervention drained him further, underscoring the unsustainable nature of dominance built solely on coercion. Labor continued, yet its quality and reliability had diminished, and Edward's confidence in absolute authority waned under the mounting strain. The psychological consequences were unmistakable. Years of power exercised through cruelty left Edward incapable of forming genuine human connections. The isolation he had long ignored now pressed visibly upon him. He moved through his estate, haunted by the absence of trust, companionship, and loyalty. The same fear he had cultivated to ensure obedience now reflected back in a mirror of solitude, empty hallways and silent fields, memories of children who had labored tirelessly, parents who had endured humiliation, and families who had fled his control emerged with persistent clarity. Regret, long suppressed, began to dominate his thoughts. Families under his former control navigated survival with ingenuity. Children escaped supervision whenever possible. Parents protected essential resources, and households coordinated quietly to preserve independence. These small but persistent acts chipped away at Edward's authority. Labor that had once been predictably productive became inconsistent. Obedience waned, and fear no longer served as a universal deterrent. Edward interpreted these shifts with frustration and disbelief, unable to fully comprehend that the resilience of those he had oppressed could not be contained indefinitely. The Hendersons, despite years of suffering, gradually reclaimed autonomy. The eldest son returned briefly, not as a laborer but as a protector, retrieving what had been hidden or safeguarded from Edward's oversight. The mother instructed her remaining children in tactics of discretion and survival. The household learned to navigate the space between observation and autonomy, leveraging subtle opportunities to regain control over daily life. Every cautious victory highlighted the growing fragility of Edward's dominion. The Williamson family's quiet defiance intensified. Children were trained in awareness and mobility. Parents safeguarded resources, and households collaborated to outmaneuver oversight. Subtle acts, delays in work, concealed tools, minor inefficiencies began to compound, eroding the precision Edward had demanded for decades. His responses grew more severe, yet each measure only emphasized the widening gap between authority and actual controls, and Edward's own life became a feedback loop of frustration, vigilance, and isolation. The mechanisms of dominance he had perfected now demanded more energy and attention than they had ever required. Social networks eroded, labor became unreliable, and resistance emerged in ways he could not anticipate. The solitude he had previously ignored now manifested as a pervasive, almost physical weight. The emptiness of a life built on cruelty was undeniable, and regret began to shape every observation, every action, and every reflection. Even as he attempted to tighten control, the cumulative effects of resistance, flight, and strategic defiance highlighted the limitations of power based solely on oppression. Families retained agency despite decades of coercion. Children, mothers, and fathers exhibited ingenuity, survival instincts, and coordination that undermined authority in subtle but decisive ways. Edward's perception of invincibility was eroded, revealing the inherent instability of his empire. The human consequences of Edward's life of cruelty became painfully visible. The Hendersons had endured physical exhaustion, emotional trauma, and the fracturing of family structure, yet they now displayed resilience and agency. The Williamsons, though battered by years of oppression, successfully reclaimed fragments of independence. Across Maryland, the echoes of his tyranny were visible in the lives of those he had controlled. But so too was the emergence of resistance, resilience, and survival. Isolation deepened, not as punishment but as natural consequence. Those who remained near Edward obeyed superficially. Social circles avoided him, and laborers operated with minimal engagement. The personal cost of decades spent cultivating fear and obedience manifested as profound solitude. Authority, once absolute, no longer brought power over hearts or minds. Regret became the dominant companion, a constant reminder of opportunities squandered and humanity betrayed. Edward's awareness of consequences grew alongside isolation. He observed fields where laborers were missing, workshops where efficiency had declined, and households where obedience had become calculated rather than genuine. He understood intellectually and emotionally that decades of cruelty had produced a landscape defined by resentment, fear, and estrangement. Each step he took through his property reminded him of control lost, relationships severed, and the absence of trust or loyalty. The weight of his life's choices pressed unrelentingly. Wealth, land, and prestige could not compensate for the absence of connection. Fear, which had sustained obedience for decades, could not sustain relationships or companionship. Labor, extracted with precision, could not replace mutual respect or human dignity. Edward's world, once meticulously controlled, now functioned independently of his authority. The systems he had relied upon to enforce compliance were fractured, leaving only the stark reality of solitude and regret. The families he had dominated persisted beyond his reach. Children thrived in hidden corners. Parents orchestrated survival and protection, and communities quietly maintained cohesion, despite decades of oppression. Edward, surrounded by evidence of both the suffering he had caused and the resilience of those he had oppressed, confronted the moral and emotional consequences of his life in a way that decades of power and intimidation had previously shielded him from. The psychological toll was total. Solitude, frustration, and recognition of irreversible harm replaced confidence, charm, and authority. The mechanisms of control, once effective, now served only to remind Edward of limitations he could no longer overcome. Every empty field, abandoned house, and absent family member reflected the profound human cost of his choices. Regret, cumulative and persistent, had taken root in a life defined by domination rather than empathy, cruelty rather than compassion. Maryland bore witness to the outcomes of Edward Carmichael's life. The families he had sought to control emerged resilient, quietly reconstructing lives that were once dictated by fear. Children learned independence, mothers nurtured recovery, and fathers reclaimed dignity. Edward, confined within a mansion of wealth and emptiness, observed these outcomes with a growing awareness that the empire he had built would endure only in absence and oppression, while the human spirit he sought to dominate persisted despite him. Solitude, regret, and awareness of consequences became Edward's constant companions. Authority no longer extended beyond superficial obedience. Relationships were transactional, and labor continued only in fragments. The psychological and social costs of decades spent on cruelty were impossible to ignore. Every memory, every absent family member, every subtle act of defiance reinforced the lesson he had ignored for decades. Power achieved through fear and oppression carries an inevitable cost, measured in isolation, remorse, and the enduring resilience of those oppressed. The estate that had once symbolized Edward Carmichael's mastery over labor, families, and the rhythm of Maryland life now felt like a hollow shell. The fields lay half-tended, the workshops quiet, and the once bustling household had grown eerily silent. Children who had obeyed without question now lived elsewhere. Mothers had carved out refuge beyond his reach, and fathers who had endured relentless oppression now reclaimed autonomy in distant counties. The evidence of resistance was everywhere, a quiet but persistent reminder that no system of fear could endure indefinitely. Edward walked through the halls of his mansion, each room echoing with absence. Servants performed only the minimum, moving with mechanical, precision that lacked the obedience and reverence he had once demanded. Spouses, siblings, and extended family maintained polite distance, their interactions shaped by obligation rather than affection. Conversations were clipped, smiles polite but hollow. The social networks that had reinforced his authority now existed as fragile facades, barely masking disengagement. Every step, every gesture reminded him of the trust, loyalty, and companionship he had sacrificed in favor of domination. Even the labor that remained was compromised. Crops were harvested sporadically, livestock required supervision he could no longer enforce, and workshops operated with inconsistent diligence. Tasks that had once been executed with near-perfect obedience now faltered under the weight of subtle resistance. Every inefficiency, every lapse reflected a truth Edward could not ignore. The empire he had built on fear was fragile, and the human ingenuity he had suppressed for decades now operated quietly against him. Isolation was total and unrelenting. The companions he had cultivated through intimidation now existed only at a distance, their compliance superficial. Social circles avoided engagement, fearful of association or indifferent to his presence. Even those who remained physically close maintained emotional separation. The mansion, vast and ornate, had become a prison of solitude, its wealth meaningless without genuine human connection. Edward's mastery over others had created a world in which he was alone, surrounded by reminders of lives he had controlled and broken. The Hendersons, who had survived years under his domination, thrived quietly beyond his influence. The eldest son had established a life of independence, reclaiming resources and dignity that Edward had once denied him. The mother safeguarded the well-being of her children, teaching them lessons of survival and self-preservation that would endure across generations. The youngest children, once shadows of themselves, explored the boundaries of autonomy with careful curiosity. Each act of reclamation, subtle and deliberate, chipped away at the remnants of Edward's authority. The Williamson family demonstrated resilience in equal measure. Children moved freely, parents coordinated to protect property, and households collaborated to preserve resources and agency. Tasks were executed efficiently, but only when it aligned with survival or self-interest. Every act, while seemingly mundane, represented resistance that Edward could neither fully observe nor control. The systems he had relied upon for decades, obedience, fear, and meticulous supervision, had been undermined by the very individuals he had sought to dominate. Psychological consequences for Edward were profound. The solitude he had cultivated or ignored now weighed heavily. The absence of trust, loyalty, and empathy was palpable. Memories of obedience were replaced with recollections of defiance, flights of laborers and households that had outmaneuvered him at every turn. Regret became persistent and unavoidable. Decisions made to enforce control, to assert dominance, and to extract labor now revealed themselves as moral failures, producing a solitude intensified by the awareness of the harm he had caused. Even attempts to reassert control failed. Punishments carried out with precision now elicited only superficial compliance. Subtle delays or calculated errors, threats once sufficient to instill obedience, were met with quiet resistance, avoidance, or cunning evasion. Edward had mastered cruelty, yet the resilience, ingenuity, and determination of those he had oppressed had rendered his mastery incomplete. The methods that had ensured compliance no longer guaranteed it, leaving him exposed, frustrated, and increasingly aware of the consequences of a life spent in domination. The physical estate itself became a testament to decline. Fields once meticulously maintained grew uneven and partially abandoned. Crops suffered from neglect. Workshops operated sporadically, and the rhythm of daily labor was disrupted by absences and subtle sabotage. Each tangible failure mirrored the invisible erosion of authority, reinforcing the lesson that oppression, no matter how expertly executed, cannot suppress the resilience of human agency. Isolation within the household mirrored isolation across his social sphere. Family members maintained distance, servants operated mechanically, and neighbors engaged only superficially. The social structures Edward had relied upon for visibility, influence, and reinforcement of authority had collapsed into formalities, leaving him without genuine companionship. Wealth and status could no longer compensate for the absence of human connection. The realization that his life, defined by cruelty and control, had produced nothing beyond solitude and regret became impossible to ignore. The moral consequences were equally unavoidable. Edward's awareness of the suffering he had inflicted on the Hendersons, the Williamsons, and countless others created an unrelenting weight. He recognized the long-term trauma endured by children forced into labor, the exhaustion of parents stripped of autonomy, and the fractured households he had left behind. Every aspect of his wealth, every meticulously managed field, every house under his supervision now existed as evidence of oppression, a physical reminder of the human cost of his ambition. Attempts to reclaim influence proved futile. Families had coordinated, fled, and adapted in ways that rendered Edward's authority incomplete. Children moved independently, parents protected resources, and communities quietly supported one another. The labor that remained was compliant only in form, superficial in practice. Each effort to reassert dominance highlighted the inadequacy of power rooted solely in fear and coercion. Edward confronted the reality that his control, absolute in theory, was now partial and increasingly irrelevant. Emotional consequences deepened the isolation. The mansion, vast and filled with symbols of wealth, reflected absence and disconnection. Silence replaced conversation, mechanical compliance replaced obedience, and hollow civility replaced trust. The weight of decades spent on cruelty, domination, and extraction of labor manifested in loneliness that could not be alleviated by material wealth or social standing. Regret was constant, an unavoidable companion reminding Edward of every harm inflicted, every family fractured, and every human life devalued. Even as he walked through the remnants of his estate, Edward encountered signs of defiance and resilience everywhere. Fields were not entirely abandoned, yet laborers operated independently and unpredictably. Homes that had once been controlled functioned autonomously, maintained by families who had reclaimed agency. Children who had been trained in obedience now moved freely, their actions guided by survival, ingenuity, and autonomy rather than fear. Each sight, each realization, reinforced the permanence of his failures. Isolation, regret, and awareness of consequences became inseparable. Edward's life, once defined by domination, now reflected the cumulative effects of decades of cruelty. Wealth, status, and labor no longer provided influence over hearts, minds, or loyalty. The very methods that had ensured obedience, the fear, punishment, and surveillance, now underscored the fragility and impermanence of power based solely on oppression. Each empty room, each absent family, and each act of subtle defiance reinforced a life dominated by mistakes that could not be undone. Maryland, shaped by the outcomes of Edward's cruelty, bore witness to resilience. Families rebuilt in quiet corners, children reclaimed innocence, and communities adapted to the realities of survival beyond his reach. The labor he had once extracted for decades continued in modified, self-directed forms. Edward, confined within the mansion of wealth and memories, faced the inescapable truth: the human spirit, even after prolonged oppression, persisted beyond the reach of fear and domination. Every aspect of Edward's life now reflected isolation and regret. Wealth surrounded him, but it could not buy companionship. Power remained, but it could not restore trust. Labor continued, but it was no longer an extension of control. The mansion, fields, and workshops became reminders of the human cost of cruelty, persistence of resilience, and inevitability of consequence. The lives he had sought to dominate flourished in ways he could not touch, while he remained alone, haunted by the full weight of choices made over decades. Edward's legacy, paradoxically, existed in absence and persistence. The families he had harmed endured, rebuilt, and adapted. Children carried lessons of resilience and autonomy that would echo across generations. Communities learned the limits of oppression and the power of coordinated survival. Edward, meanwhile, experienced the permanence of isolation, the relentlessness of regret, and the inescapability of moral consequence. Power founded on cruelty had delivered wealth and status, but it had also ensured solitude, estrangement, and enduring remorse. The mansion's silence was absolute. Edward moved through the halls, past rooms once bustling with labor and obedience, now filled only with echoes. Servants performed the minimum, children were absent, and family members remained distant. Wealth surrounded him, but the human connection necessary to make it meaningful was gone. Every glance at the estate, every observation of the land and remaining labor, reminded him that control achieved through fear is temporary, and that resilience, ingenuity, and determination persist despite decades of oppression. Edward Carmichael's life, once a testament to dominance, became a cautionary record of consequence. Every act of cruelty, every decision to prioritize fear over compassion, produced outcomes that could not be undone. Families thrived in spite of him. Laborers survived and adapted. Communities endured. And Edward, surrounded by wealth but bereft of trust, loyalty, or companionship, confronted the stark reality that a life devoted to oppression leads ultimately to solitude, regret, and the permanent awareness of harm inflicted on others.